Now, before I get into the timeline thing, one of the things as we look at this peculiar book, and I really mean the collection of 66 books, one of the most amazing things that hits you, if you study it honestly and carefully, is its amazing freedom from technical error. As I was trying to put in perspective the whole history, trying to say, gee, let's take, not the future yet, we'll save that for tomorrow night, but history, and what does the Bible say about that to the skeptical, to the doubter. I'm not talking about getting into the Word from a common position of faith, that's what we're usually trying to do, but rather step back and look at it as a skeptic and what do we know about what it says. And one of the most amazing things, if you take a technical journal, say in physics or almost any field of science, that's as little as a year or two old. Or those of you that have graduated from college some time ago, how quaint it is to go back and look at your technical textbooks and understand how our views of everything, from matter to space, everything, has changed. How interesting it is this book has been unchanged by centuries. And we could easily spend the entire hour together going over incredible examples. It's anticipation of the circulation of the blood long before Harvey. It's, I go on and on and on. But my favorite one happens to be one in Psalm 19, because a lot of people like to say, there's a phrase in there in Psalm 19 where it says, speaking of the sun, how a circuit is from one end of heaven to the other, and his path is from one end of heaven to the other, and a circuit unto the ends of it. And people love to chuckle at the quaintness, you see, of the Ptolemaic system. So see, there's an evidence that whoever wrote that was a product of the Ptolemaic cosmology. That's where we have the Earth and the sun going around the Earth. And the writer thought the sun went around the Earth. And we're, of course, beneficiaries of what we would call the Copernicus cosmology. We know that the Earth revolves around the sun. And isn't the Bible quaint? Well, it's fine, it's a literary thing, and they did the best they could with the understanding they have. No, wait a minute. You go read that again. It says the sun's circuit is from one end of heaven to the other. And if the Copernican scholar had done a little more homework, he'd discover there's a thing called a galaxy, and that while we are rotating on our axis, and then as we revolve around the sun is in the meantime revolving around our galactic axis, and its circuit, guess what, is from one end of heaven to the other. And so it's very interesting how you can get into these things, and you'll discover as you get behind these things that the Bible is inerrant. You'll hear people talk about that. There are no errors. Yes, there are poetic phrases. Yes, there are metaphors. Speaks of God as covering us with his wings. Does that mean God has feathers? No, it's a figure of speech we all understand because we've seen a bird shelter her young. So there's figures of speech, of course. But is there scientific error? Fascinatingly enough, no. Great men of science that know the Scripture and go at it honestly will stand up and take item by item. It is free from error. It's free of error of other kinds too, but I'll just touch on that. Well, we could spend a lot of time on that. I don't really want to do too much of that because we'll take the whole hour on that, because I'm not sure that leads to anything other than a respect for this, and one can build a whole case that's another evidence that its origin is extraterrestrial. Fine. The next thing I started to do was to start taking a look at all the historical prophecies in the Scripture. And you can start, of course, what's so visible in the Scripture is the history of the nation Israel. And what is fascinating, the Bible not only chronicles the history of Israel, it predicts it. And we could spend the whole hour on examples of how the Bible anticipated in advance the history of Israel. And rather than go through a whole chronicle of that, let me just highlight a few places that you might choose to look, if you want to get into that. You could actually take the entire study and make a whole series of messages out of that, or studies out of that. The book of Daniel is perhaps the most dramatic example. Well, let me back up. One of the great events in the history of Israel, of course, is when it went into slavery, into captivity. And the prophets, Ezekiel and Jeremiah and others, speak of that captivity. In fact, one of the interesting things is that both Jeremiah and Ezekiel spoke of that event, and Jeremiah particularly was made fun of because some of the details of his prophecies contradicted Ezekiel's. One of them had predicted that Zedekiah was going to be enslaved. The captivity come during his reign and he would be enslaved. And the other had said that Zedekiah would never see the Babylonian captivity. And this discrepancy was pointed out to Jeremiah. He was made fun of. In fact, he's actually imprisoned and some other things. But when we go back and read those prophecies carefully, and then we also look at the historical record, we discover that when the siege was successful, they came in, they bound Zedekiah. Before his eyes, they slaughtered his sons, and then they put out his eyes, put him in fetters of brass, and carried him off to Babylon. And then you go back and read Ezekiel and Jeremiah, and you realize that both were right. He died in Babylon, yet he never saw it, as Ezekiel predicted. So as we see that, we're not only impressed with prophecy, we also notice that our God is a God of detail. And the prophecies need to be examined very, very carefully. One of the difficulties in trying to conduct sort of just an overview is the most interesting, precise prophecies happen to be quite technical, and we can spend a lot of time in the text. But I'm going to want to talk a little bit later about Daniel anyway. It's hard to talk about many of these things because they deal with today, and I want to leave the stuff that deals with today for tomorrow night, okay? If you were going to jump in and take an Old Testament book and try to really master it and understand it and get into it, there are many good choices. One of the ones that happens to be the one that impressed me the most in my youth was the book of Daniel. I was very intrigued with Daniel for lots of reasons. Those of you that know the story know that he was deported in the first siege of Nebuchadnezzar. The siege, the captivity actually was in 3 phases. And we'll talk about that tomorrow night because it has some implications for today. And he was deported in the first siege of Nebuchadnezzar, taken as a young man, as a teenager probably, to Babylon and educated at court. In effect, put in postgraduate school to learn the Babylonian ways and become, in effect, a member of the court, a staff man, if you will. And the chronicle of his life is incredible. It's particularly interesting for you and I, as Gentiles, to read because early in his career, the king saw a vision which Daniel interprets. It happens to be an outline of all human history, all of Gentile rulership. And then later on, as he matures, he becomes, and Babylon falls. Babylon falls, as you probably know, to a coalition between the Medes and the Persians. And there's a very interesting story. Babylon, of course, felt it was invincible. Daniel was by now an old man. Nebuchadnezzar's grandson was in charge, and he was convinced they were invisible. So even though the Persian army was camped outside on the perimeter, they just celebrated. They knew they could not, get through the walls. Well, what Cyrus was famous for doing was sending one of his divisions upriver. Babylon was a gigantic city, but it was dependent, of course, on a water supply from that river. And he had his divisions up north seal off the river. And upon a point in time when the river dropped, his army could enter under the gates and get in and take the city, which Cyrus did. And when he conquered the Babylon fell. This is described in Daniel chapter 5 and other books. He discovers he's not only conquered Babylon, which was then the capital of the world at the time, but he also inherited these Hebrew slaves. And one of them, that was in a very high position of power, presented him a scroll of an ancient book, ancient then, several centuries old, a scroll of Isaiah. And it's a matter of history that when Cyrus, the king, read from this dusty, musty old scroll, he fell upon what was called to his attention was a passage which we call the end of Isaiah chapter 44. And he's rather startled to find that there was a letter written to him more than 100, probably 200 years before Cyrus was born. And it starts, we typically start about verse 27 of chapter 44, where God, speaking through Isaiah, said, "Who saith to the deep, Be dry, and I will dry up thy rivers. Who saith of Cyrus," that's got to surprise you. Oh, gee, there's a guy he's talking to just like my name, right? "He is my shepherd, he shall perform all my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, Thou shalt be built, and to the temple thy foundation shall be laid." That's going to come later. Chapter 45, verse 1. "Thus saith the Lord to his anointed." Now, by the way, those of you that are biblical scholars should be surprised by that. This is an Old Testament passage, and Cyrus is a Gentile. Can a Gentile be anointed? Interesting. "Thus saith the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus." The answer to that, by the way, is the Lord can anoint whom he will, okay? "To Cyrus, whose right hand I have held, to subdue nations before him, and I will loose the loins of kings, to open before him the two-leaved gates." That's an expression of the main gates of Babylon, the double brass gates. "And the gates shall not be shut, and I will go before thee, and will make the crooked places straight. I will break in pieces the gates of bronze. I will cut in sunder the bars of iron. And I will give thee the treasures of darkness and the hidden riches of secret places, that thou mayest know that I, the Lord, who called thee by thy name, am the God of Israel. For Jacob my servant's sake, and Israel mine elect, I have even called thee by thy name. I have surnamed thee, even though thou hast not known me." He did this 150 years before the fact. Now, if you were Cyrus, would you be impressed? Now, you can say, well, how do we know? Well, what he did when he read this, he released them. This led to the freeing of the Israeli captives in Babylon. Now they go back. They have authority to rebuild the temple, but not the city. It's later that Nehemiah goes to the king and gets permission to rebuild the city walls. And we're going to talk something about that a little later. But I just mentioned this as an example of something we can relate to, a matter of history where prophecy before the fact was not only fulfilled, the recognition of its fulfillment resulted in that history being continued in God's plan. In other words, God knew that when Cyrus saw this, he'd be impressed and it would accomplish his purpose. Very interesting ellipse there, if you will. There is a prediction the Bible made that's been fulfilled historically that unquestionably overshadows all others that it makes in both its significance and its impact and its undeniability. If I was, we here gathered tonight call ourselves Christians. We worship Jesus Christ. If you walk in other parts of the world, you'll find there are people that follow a Buddha or Confucius or someone else. And a good question that's often asked, what makes Christ different? Great teacher, certainly has had a profound ethical effect on the Western world, but what made him different? Many of the teachings that he taught you can find in some of these other religions. Certainly you can find much of the ethics. You can find much of, especially at the personal level. What makes him different? The thing that made him different was that the way was prepared before him, like no other individual in human history. Every detail of his life was laid out in advance. Now, it turns out that if you took the trouble to wade through the Old Testament, you could find over 300. One person's actually listed 333 prophecies, predictions of Jesus Christ that were part of the Old Testament. Now, I like that because the Old Testament was translated into Greek 3 centuries before Christ was born. You can say to yourself, I don't care who wrote Daniel or Isaiah or Genesis? Did Moses write the Pentateuch? For our purpose, it doesn't matter. Because when Alexander the Great conquered the world, including Jewry, he enforced Greek as the language. He was later, became Roman and so forth, but the language universal in the Mediterranean area for sure was Greek. If you were raised in a Jewish household, you probably did not know Hebrew unless you were being trained as a priest or an ecclesiastic of some kind. Hebrew is preserved as a language in much the same way that the Catholics preserve Latin. We don't realize that because it's so distant from our culture, so we're not probably sensitive to that. Because that was true, 70 Jewish scholars gathered in Alexandria and undertook the translation of their sacred scriptures into Greek, because the average Jew didn't know Hebrew. So the analogy is very similar to what happened in the Reformation, where we had the Latin translated into English. Same analogy. These 70 scholars translated the Hebrew scriptures into Greek so that the average Jew on the street could read and understand his heritage. They called that translation the Septuagint, 70 scholars, Septuagint version. That's the one, incidentally, it's often quoted in the New Testament. It was translated, started 285, finished in 270 BC, roughly 3 centuries before Jesus Christ was born. Now, what's neat about that is it doesn't matter who was the original author of which book, for our purpose, that is in black and white. Now, what I'd like to do, we've got a list here of 333 prophecies that I thought we'd go through tonight in detail. You think I'm kidding? Okay. Let's take just a few of them. In Peter's second letter, turn with me to 2 Peter 1. It occurred to me maybe I'll do better by telling you where I'm headed rather than be elliptical here. Bear in mind, this letter, it's the second letter of Peter. We're going to be in chapter 1. Peter was an eyewitness to the ministry of Jesus Christ. He was with our Lord. He was among the inner circle. We usually see Peter, James, and John as the inners of all the disciples. They're close in. There are lots of things that happen only where they're present. The others weren't necessarily there. So Peter, James, and John are sort of clearly seem to be an inner circle. Peter was right there during the ministry, right? And he makes reference to the fact that he was an eyewitness. If you look at chapter 1, verse 16, Peter's saying, "For we have not followed cunningly devised fables, when we made known unto you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but were eyewitnesses of his majesty." Now, he's incidentally speaking, of course, specifically of the Transfiguration. But the general is also true. He's an eyewitness. But when he gets to verse 19, he makes a strange remark. He's speaking, hey, now, I'm an eyewitness. Nevertheless, we have also a more sure word of prophecy. What Peter's saying is that not only is he certain of all these things because he was an eyewitness, but even more than that, we have the assurance that we get from prophecy. Now, that's a strange remark. What do you mean by that, Peter? You were there, you saw it, we can understand how you might feel. And, of course, one of the most remarkable things is that all of them, under penalty of torture and death, of course, reaffirmed continually the whole story. So we have to get into that tonight. That's a whole other thing. But here's Peter, an eyewitness, saying that prophecy gives us a higher degree of assurance than if we saw it with our own eyes. Now, what does he mean? And I'm going to try and answer that by what's become quite a classic package here. And I'd like to take a few prophecies, and then I'd like to talk to you just a little bit as to how do we measure certainty. First of all, let's take a look at, and obviously we will not take the time tonight to go through 333. I'm going to take 8 of them. I want to take 8 prophecies for 2 reasons: to give you a sampling of the kind of thing I have in mind, and then to use those 8 as a model to show you something about the information sciences. The first prophecy I'm going to take on would be Micah chapter 5. This is, I'm sure, familiar to most of you. Anyone that's ever received a significant number of Christmas cards is familiar with Micah chapter 5, verse 2. Through Micah, God is speaking to a small town. It's in a county, if you will. It's called Ephratah. There's actually 2 Bethlehems. This is where it says, "But thou, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah." In other words, though you be one of the smallest little towns of the thousands of little burgs that make up Judah, "yet out of thee shall he come forth unto me, that is to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth have been from old, from everlasting." That actually tells you many things. It happens to tell you, first of all I'm interested in tonight is, where was the Mashiach, the Messiah of Israel, to be born? Bethlehem, right. When the wise men came to Herod, Matthew, right? The wise men saw a star, came to Jerusalem, came to Herod. He says, where are you to be born? His experts went to the scriptures and found out it was to be in Bethlehem. How'd they know? From Micah chapter 5, verse 2. It was understood among Jews that the Messiah was to be born in Bethlehem. How'd they know? From this passage. When was this passage written? At least 3 centuries before Christ was born. Actually much earlier, but that we're just going to say 300 years or earlier. We're not going to concern ourselves. Was it really Micah or his uncle or something? I mean, there's a book called Micah, translated in black and white, predicts the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem. Okay. Now, maybe what I want to do, let me back up a minute. As we go, I want to assign some numbers to these things. Well, let's take some prophecies first. We start with Micah 5:2. Turn with me to Malachi 3:1. Just go to Matthew, turn left. You get to Malachi. The last book in the Old Testament. And I'm interested in Malachi chapter 3, verse 1. "Behold, I will send my messenger, and he shall prepare the way before me. And the Lord whom ye seek shall suddenly come to his temple, even the messenger of the covenant whom ye delight, and behold, he shall come, saith the Lord of hosts." Okay? Now there's many passages like this. I'm just picking one. It's prophetic of whom? John the Baptist, right on. Okay, that's easy. That's an easy one. Turn with me to Zechariah 9:9. Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9. Where the Lord, speaking through Zechariah, says, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, thy king cometh unto thee. He is just and having salvation, lowly, and riding upon an ass, and upon a colt, the foal of an ass." In other words, not only a donkey, but an unbroken colt, to be more precise. Zechariah predicts that when the Messiah of Israel makes his formal presentation to Jerusalem as king, he'll do it on a donkey. That prophecy has a lot for us, but I'll save that for a little bit. The main point here is we have him predicted to go on a donkey. Good. While we're in Zechariah, we can pick up a couple of dandies here. Let's go to chapter 11. And I'm interested in verse 12 and 13. I'll just take verse 12, okay. "He said unto me, If you think good, give me my price, and if not, forbear." This is Zechariah chapter 11, verses 12 and 13. "So they weighed for my price 30 pieces of silver. And the Lord said unto me, Cast it unto the potter, a lordly price that I was prized out of them. And I took the 30 pieces of silver and cast them to the potter in the house of the Lord." This little prophecy describes the price that Jesus Christ was betrayed, right? 30 pieces of silver. It also tells you, do you remember now the story? You remember what happened? Judas betrayed Jesus Christ for how much? 30 pieces of silver. He regretted it, remember? And he went back, right? He felt somehow that if you gave the money back, he could undo all this. And of course, things don't work that way. You make a decision and you live with it. So the priest said, "That's your problem." He says, in fact, there's so much to go into, I'm going to get trapped with time if I try to take it all. Satan, speaking through Judas, gives us one of the authorities of Christ's perfection. Because he speaks through Judas and says, "I have betrayed innocent blood," which is kind of interesting if you're really into the theology of what's going on. But anyway, so he throws the 30 pieces of silver on the ground, goes out and hangs himself. The priests look at each other, and they've got 30 pieces of silver on the floor. It's against the law for them to take blood money into the treasury. But they're clever guys. They also have an obligation to bury foreigners. If someone comes to the city as a foreigner and dies, it's the temple's problem to bury him. So they have that anticipated expense. So we can't take the 30 pieces of silver into the treasury. That's against the law. What we can do is go out and buy a field, a potter's field, to bury strangers in. In other words, it's like, and you can't take the money into your bank account, but you can pay an anticipated expense. That's what they do. Who ends up with the money? The potter that owned the field. Where did the transaction take place? In the temple. All this is in this prophecy. And the Lord said unto me, cast it unto the potter. And I took the 30 pieces of silver and cast them to the potter. Where? In the house of the Lord. He did the casting in the house of the Lord. The money, of course, ends up in the hands of the potter. Isn't that interesting? This is actually written about 800 years before Christ was born, but we'll just treat it as part of the Old Testament, translated into Greek 3 centuries before Christ was born. One other thing that I love, and as long as I'm in Zechariah, turn over to chapter 13 and look at verse 6. And one shall say unto him, what are these wounds in thine hands? Those with which I was, and he shall answer, those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. Now, when I first noted this in my Bible studies many, many years ago, and I was in those days fond of memorizing things, I made up a little card to memorize this verse. Because I said, wow, here's another reference to the fact that Jesus Christ had wounds in his hands, Old Testament. So I put it in my little index. When I still went to memorize, I had trouble with that. He shall answer, those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. And it bothered me because he didn't get the wounds in the house of his friends. The Romans drove the nails through his hands out there on Golgotha, hardly in the house of his friends. And the more I thought about it, what I thought this had reference to was the fact the Romans driving nails in his hands. But then when I got in the New Testament and recognized that first night after his resurrection, he appeared among his disciples, and they were all frightened. They were locked doors. He appears to them, and he says, and they're all frightened. He says, I'm not a ghost. I'm not a spirit. A spirit does not have flesh and bone. Handle me and see. Well, and he eats with them. That week, they run around. They tell Thomas happened to be absent. They tell Thomas, hey, guess what happened last night? And he said, sure. Unless I put my fingers in his nail prints and my hand in his thigh, I will not believe. So next time they're all together, locked doors. The Lord comes up, walks up to Thomas, and what does Thomas do? He falls on his knees and says, my Lord and my God, and worshiped him. And when I read this verse in Zechariah, I come to the conclusion, it wasn't the Roman nails that wounded him. It was Thomas's unbelief. Interesting. Do you ever wonder how much grief we cause him? But what I want right now from this verse is simply the fact that he had wounds in his hands. We can't talk prophecy without going to Isaiah 53. If we had time tonight, we could do little better than read Isaiah 53, because in Isaiah chapter 53 we have a more vivid description of the reason of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ than you'll probably find in the New Testament. Some people call this passage the Holy of Holies of the Old Testament. And I won't take the time tonight because I think it takes a very slow meditative time. You should do it yourself. Just read Isaiah. In fact, start at 3 verses early, end of 52, and read Isaiah 53 with the awareness that what God is talking about in anticipation is the crucifixion of his Son. But all we're going to do is mention a couple of things here. Verse 3, I was despised, rejected of men, a man of sorrows, and acquainted with grief, and we hid as it were our faces from him, and so on. And verse 4 and 5 give us the reason. He hath borne our griefs, he had carried our sorrows, and yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. All we, like sheep, have gone astray. Everyone has turned to his own way. But the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Amazing summary of the whole issue of what the Bible is about. Verse 7, he was oppressed and he was afflicted and he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb. And this is the lamb. It's the lamb, not a lamb. But anyway, to the slaughter. And as a sheep before his shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. He's taken from prison and from judgment, and who shall declare his generation? For he's cut off out of the land of the living. For the transgression of my people was he stricken. He was cut off. The word's karat in Hebrew. We're going to come back to that later in another thing I'm going to bring up later. But anyway, verse 9, he made his grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, because he had done no violence, neither was any deceit found in his mouth. And on it goes. Now, out of these couple of verses, verse 7 and verse 9, I only want two facts. One is that he made no defense, even though he's innocent. He was innocent, but he made no defense. He opened not his mouth. Predicted. We could find, actually, by the way, you could probably find 100 little details in here, but I'm just going to pick a couple obvious ones. There's also a peculiar contradiction. It says that he made his grave with the wicked, and yet he's with the rich in his death. Now, that's kind of strange. I mean, one's glory, one's despised. One's honored, one's dishonored. And yet, as we see what happened, he was crucified between two thieves. And yet he was buried in the tomb of what probably was the richest man of the area, Joseph of Arimathea. Okay, one last thing, and then I'll try to show you where I'm headed. Turn to Psalm. Just as we cannot talk these things without Isaiah 53, we also cannot touch upon these things without turning to Psalm 22. Now, Psalm 22 is familiar to us because the very first verse is something Jesus Christ himself quoted from the cross. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? And if you read Psalm 22, it's hard not to imagine yourself as the author hanging from the cross looking down. Psalm 22 is a wonderful psalm, but you don't really get into it until you realize what's going on here. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? And on it goes. Skim down to, I won't take the whole thing. Let's skip down to verse 7. All they that see me laugh me to scorn. They shoot out the lips and they shake the head, saying, he trusted in the Lord that he would deliver him. Let him deliver him, seeing he delighted him. Can you see him looking down there, hearing people make fun of him? The people that are saying, hey, trust the Lord, let him bring it. Remember, go into Matthew 28, whatever, and read the cross scene. It's our Lord himself anticipated this centuries before the fact. We go to verse 14. I'm poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, it is melted within me. My strength is dried up like a potsherd. My tongue, verse 15, cleaveth to my jaws. Thou hast brought me to the dust of death. For dogs have compassed me. Dogs? What's the Jewish word? Goyim. Gentiles. Right. For dogs have compassed me. The assembly of the wicked have enclosed me. And here's the interesting verse. They pierced my hands and my feet. Now, this is not the only place it appears. Also, Zechariah, speaking of the second coming of Jesus Christ, when he comes upon the earth, he says, they are going to look upon me whom they have pierced. So that concept of being pierced is through several places in prophecy. What makes that amazing is, what was the form of capital punishment in Israel? Stoning. Always was. Stoning. Crucifixion was invented by the Romans about 90 BC. This was written several centuries, many centuries, before the Romans invented crucifixion. And yet the Bible predicts crucifixion of the Messiah. Verse 18, they part my garments among them, and they cast lots upon my vesture. And the Gospels record how the Roman soldiers divided up his belongings, but the seamless robe was too valuable to tear up and divide. They cast lots for it. Anticipate in Psalm 22. And we could spend a lot of time in this area and read Psalm 22 and hear the Lord talk to you from the cross. And if you understand what it has to do with you, read Isaiah 53. And they'll speak for themselves. And they're both out of the Old Testament, not the New. They did it without the benefit of Paul. Okay? People love to say, well, that's Pauline theology. Well, let me tell you, Paul had a couple of interesting disciples 800 years before Christ was born. And of course, being flippant, except what's interesting is there is no God of the Old Testament, God of the New. There's one God, the same yesterday, today, and forever. And when we understand that, when we separate ourselves from these Sunday school notions that we get in a lot of denominational settings, that somehow this is an evolutionary concept, that's nonsense. Now, what have I done here? I've picked 8 prophecies, and I want to talk about 333, but we don't have time. So I'm going to take these 8, and the reason I've chosen these 8 is they're relatively simple. They don't get into a lot of technicalities. Some of the 333 really are quite technical, candidly. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to talk about probabilities. You know, we say we know this or know that, but if you are precise, if you're a scientist in the information sciences, you take the position that nothing is certain. If something would be certain conceptually, we would say that it has a probability of 1, or that the odds are 100%, you want to put it that way. And a scientist would say that nothing has a probability of 1. It might have 0.99999 forever, but I mean, there's always room for a modification. That's just conceptual. Nothing has a probability of 0. And what we try to do is they try to measure certainty in the etymology of the probability, the theory of probability, and its whole and the whole assorted science operations that come out of that. And I'm reminded of 2 statisticians that were taking a flight together, airplane flight, and they happened to occur. Remember, some years ago, there was quite an era of bomb threats. If you recall, there was a whole thing for quite a while, many years ago. And these 2 guys were sitting on the plane, and they were getting ready to take off, and the one guy says, you know, I've really done a study. I've calculated all the flights, the number of bomb threats, and so forth, and I've divided this all out, and I've come to the conclusion that there's less than 1 chance in 1,000 that there's a bomb aboard this airplane. Well, his buddy wasn't too impressed. He says, 1 in 1,000? That doesn't sound too comfortable. I mean, you know, that means you're... He says, well, you don't understand. He says, wait a minute, you don't understand. If there's a probability of 1 in 1,000 that there's a bomb aboard this airplane, then there's a probability, the probability of 2 bombs on board this airplane is 1 over 1,000 times 1 over 1,000, or 1 over 1,000,000. Well, he says, that sounds a little better, but what are you getting at? He says, well, I always carry my own bomb. Okay? Now, I say that because it's obvious. The reason that's funny is that's obviously a misapplication of probability theory. Those things, that's a conditional situation. Okay? But incidentally, the point that the reason that the naivete of the guy, of course, it's wrong because it's the things he's dealing in the conditional. But if there were independent probabilities, if indeed there's an event that can occur 1 in 1,000 times, the probability of 2 events occurring like that at the same time would be 1 in 1,000,000. 1 over 1,000 times 1 over 1,000, which is 1 in 1,000,000. You see how that works? Well, what I'd like to do, and this is not original with me. It made its first appearance, I believe, in a book by Peter Stoner called Science Speaks. So those of you that want to chase this down can get it from a book, but otherwise just follow me. It would be interesting to take these 8 prophecies, and that's exactly what some professors did, and have a group of probability students try to estimate the probability of any one of these happening on their own, just to see what the co-occurrence of these, if they are treating them as independent prophecies, what would be the likelihood of something like this all happening. Let me give you an example. The first prophecy we talked about was Micah 5:2, that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. You say, well, okay, what's the probability of a candidate Messiah, picked at random, having been born in Bethlehem? Well, you have to find out what the population of the earth is and how many people, what's the population of Bethlehem. Population of Bethlehem is about 7,150. Population of the world will take, just to be casual, as about 2 times 10 to the 9th, they're roughly 2 billion, at that time. That's a guess. Which, if you divide that out, says there's 1 chance in 280,000. If you took people at random, the probability at that time that they would be born in Bethlehem. Okay, you'd probably say, so what? Bear with me. 1 chance in 280,000 of someone being born in Bethlehem at random. The next prophecy, the second one, was that he would be foretold by a messenger. Okay, how many candidates for Messiah had someone running around ahead of them like John the Baptist, saying, "Prepare ye the way of the Lord, I'm his messenger," and so forth. Well, that's hard to estimate, but a very conservative guess would be 1 in 1,000. Okay? Now we get to Zechariah, third one, Zechariah 9:9, the fact that the Messiah would make his formal appearance as king to Jerusalem on the back of a donkey. Now, how many kings have presented themselves to Jerusalem on the back of a donkey? Well, I'm going to suggest that there's probably a lot we don't know about, so I'm going to say there's 1 chance in 100. Would you say it's more rare than that? Huh? So if I say 1 in 100, are you comfortable with that as being a conservative estimate? Okay. Well, then we have Zechariah 11:13. That's a wild one because we have all those things. The 30 pieces of silver, not 29 or 32 or something, 30 pieces of silver. It was done in the temple, and the money went to the potter. What's the probability of that happening by accident? It's actually 3 things. Okay. But if I figure that there's a 1 in 1,000 here and 1 in 100 there, I'll put them all together and say the 3 things have a composite probability, maybe 1 in 100,000. Okay? Now the next thing is, okay, he was wounded in his hands. Okay? How many candidate messiahs were wounded in their hands? I think we looked through history. I don't know if we know any. There might have been a couple. I'm going to say 1 in 1,000, just to be conservative. How many people, let's go to Isaiah 53:7, how many people, when they were absolutely innocent, made no attempt to defend themselves? Would you be upset if I said 1 in 100? Incidentally, my probabilities would be slightly different, but I want to stick to this because it's a classical model. I'll come back to that, but that's okay. Let's say 1 in 100. Okay, how many people were killed among the wicked and were buried with the rich? Some probably, if they're lawyers, but I'm going to get it, I can tell. I'm going to say 1 in 1,000, all right? This wasn't the U.S., it was over there. And the last one, pierced hands and feet. I say less than 1 in 1,000, okay? Now, some of these you may say, gee, that is pretty rare, and others say, gee, you've overstated, but my suggestion is if I say there's 1 in 280,000 of being born in Bethlehem, 1 in 1,000 of having a messenger precede, 1 in 100 of having making a presentation as king on a donkey, 1 in 100,000 of having 3 pieces of silver as the betrayal price, the transaction done in the temple, and the money ending up in the potter's hand. 1 in 100,000 is being generous. Wounded in the hands, 1 in 1,000. No defense, though innocent, at 1 in 100. With the wicked and with the rich in death. 1 in 1,000, and 1 in 1,000 of hands and feet being pierced. If you run those numbers out, you have to multiply each one of those, and you get 10 to the 28th. In other words, you put a 1 with 28 zeros after it. Okay? 10 to the 28th power is the way people who deal with large numbers, or very small numbers, tend to deal in powers of 10. They don't say 100, they say 10 squared, 10 to the power of 2. 10 is 10 to the power of 1. 1 is 10 to the 0 power, turns out. It's not obvious, but it is. If you haven't dealt with this, it sounds strange that something raised to the 0 power happens to be unity, okay? 10 to the 4th is 10,000. 10 to the 3rd is 1,000. Well, you start doing that's clumsy for smaller numbers, but when you start getting really big numbers, that's a handy way to do things. Very small numbers, very large numbers. It turns out if you go through these probabilities and treat them as independent, you have, and incidentally, I'm not proposing they are independent. I'm going to come quite to the other opposite conclusion. But the null hypothesis is that these are independent coincidences. What's the chance of it happening independently? See, that's what we're really about. That's what we're really all about. I kidded last time about my wristwatch. And you laughed at it. The probability that my wristwatch could have occurred by evolution, of course, is absurd. Okay? Right? We went through that last time. What we're going to do here is let's assume that these events were independent events. Just coincidence. They happened each to occur. Reasonable conjecture, let's measure it. If we take we assign a probability to each one, an a priori probability of each one, and run the math out, we have 1 chance in 10 to the 28th of this thing happening by chance. Now, if that's all I say, you say, gee, that's pretty unlikely. I guess it wasn't a coincidence. I guess it really was ordained or designed or staged. Right. But how sure are you that it was staged? You may say, gee, Chuck, those 8 prophecies are pretty convincing. You got me convinced. I think you're probably right. These are not accidents. They were managed. That, in fact, it was arranged for him to be in Bethlehem. You bet it was. The creator of the universe had to get the whole Roman Empire to set the whole world to a taxation to get Joseph and Mary in the right place. It's true, by the way, okay? And so forth. King on a donkey. Jesus Christ arranged that. He makes no bones about it. All through his ministry. When they want to take him as a king, he disappears. Won't let it happen. Mine hour is not yet come, he says. In Mark 3 times, John twice, whatever. Yet one day he says to his disciples, go such and such a place, I've arranged for a donkey, tell the guy such and so, bring the donkey here. He gets on it, he rides to Jerusalem. Why? Because it was 173,880 days after a trigger point that Daniel predicted. That was the day he had to present himself as king to Jerusalem. And he knew it. And because they didn't, he destroyed the city. Or I should say he had the Romans destroyed. In Luke chapter 19, verse 44, it says that Jerusalem was to be leveled. He wept over Jerusalem and said, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how I would have gathered thee, but ye would not. Now they will put a trench about you, level you to the ground, because you did not recognize the day of your visitation." That day, the day he rode the donkey in. Yes, it was managed. But we're making, our assumption is that it wasn't managed, it was a coincidence. Great. We have a probability of 1 in 10 to the 28th chance that it was accidental. Okay? How serious is that? Well, the way you really do that is you have to divide these 8 prophecies by the possibility of any one person in the history of the universe fulfilling that. So you divide the occasions by the number of candidates, and let's put in the candidates every person that ever lived. That seems generous. And that's estimated to be about 88 billion, or we'll call it 10 to the 11th. If you divide 10 to the 28th by 10 to the 11th, you end up with 10 to the 17th. So there's one chance in 10 to the 17th of this occurring by chance. Now, to make that meaningful to you, we have to construct an example of something that has one chance in 10 to the 17th of occurring. Okay? So let me, in our imagination, create a fictitious example of something that would be equivalent in probability to those 8 prophecies being fulfilled by accident. You take the state of Texas and you cover it with silver dollars 2 feet deep. Visualize the state of Texas covered with silver dollars 2 feet deep. Now what I want you to do, blindfolded, is wander around through the state of Texas, through these silver dollars 2 feet deep, blindfolded, enough so that any one silver dollar has an equal likelihood of being chosen, and you reach down there. Oh, by the way, before you do this, I'm going to mark one of them. I mark one of them, and I shuffle them well and spread them all over the state of Texas 2 feet deep. You wander around through the state of Texas in such a manner, whatever you want to figure, so that you have an equal likelihood of getting any one silver dollar, and you reach down there and you grab one. The probability of your getting the silver dollar that I marked is 1 in 10 to the 17th. Or, that probability is the likelihood that these 8 prophecies were fulfilled by accident, by a quirk of history, by chance. Chance is the rival conjecture. The logical conclusion, of course, is that they were designed, they were staged. If I pulled this off, you'd accuse me of collusion. Indeed, there's collusion. The creator of the universe arranged this before the foundation of the earth was laid. His deal with Jesus Christ was made before the earth was created. In Bethlehem Ephratah, Micah 5:2, it said, whose goings forth are from old, from everlasting. It also mentions the pre-existence of Jesus Christ. But that's another issue. I've only taken 8 of these prophecies. Now, if we had more time, we could go through another list of 8 more, couldn't we? You've already discovered I'm a bag of wind enough. I could easily find 8 more, right? And we could go over. Let's save time and just stipulate that I can find 8 more prophecies. In my list of 333, I've taken 8. Let's take 8 more. And let's save time and assume that the probabilities of these 8 individually are approximately the same as the first 8. Okay? If I do that, it turns out I take my 10 to the 17th, and I got another 10 to the 28th to multiply those by. Okay? And it turns out what I get is 10 to the 45th. The chances of a single human being fulfilling all 16 prophecies is 1 chance in 10 with 45 zeros. Okay? Now that, of course, has no meaning to us. Let's try to create an imaginary model to get across the idea of just how rare an event that is. Now this time again, I take a silver dollar and I mark it as being the unique one. And I make a ball of silver dollars that you're going to have to wander through and pick one. You know how that, in order to get 10 to the 45th silver dollars, do you know how big the ball is? It's a ball whose radius is 30 times the distance to the sun. You make a ball of silver dollars 30 times the distance to the sun, put on your scuba gear, wander through this ball 30 times the distance so that any one silver dollar has an equal chance of being picked by you, and you pick one and present it to me, and the probability that it has the mark that I anticipated earlier is 1 chance in 10 to the 45th, or, putting it another way, that ridiculous remote example is equivalent to the probability that one human being by chance fulfilled the 16 prophecies that we have as a matter of record that Jesus Christ fulfilled. Well, that's 16 of them, huh? We got it. We'll just reach a little further one more time. Let's take 48 prophecies. Now, bear in mind, I'm selecting 48 of 333. So I got a lot to go, but I'll select 48, and I'm going to stipulate that they have roughly the same distribution, 1 in 100, 1 to 1,000 kinds of thing. Actually, to be frank with you, as you get into the more technical ones, they become even more remote, and the mathematics becomes even more absurd. What makes this example interesting is the probabilities I've chosen are absurdly conservative, and yet the conclusion is absurd the other way. That's what I'm trying to dramatize. Take 48 prophecies. It turns out if you do that, you're talking of a probability of 1 chance in 10 to the 157th. 48 prophecies. The probability, assuming the prophecies were independent, of one man fulfilling them all. Well, for this case, we can't use silver dollars anymore to make our little example, because obviously you and I have no ability to have any understanding what 10 to the 157th is. That's something we can express and have a computer go away and crunch a little bit, but we have no concept of what it means, right? So let me construct an imaginary model of how I would try to get 10 to the 157th of anything to create a sample, to get a sampling model. Well, in this case, I won't use silver dollars. I'm going to take the smallest thing that I can relate to. In fact, it's probably too small for it. I'm going to take an electron. Not a silver dollar, an electron. Now, you'll be thrilled to know that there's 2.540 times 10 to the minus 9. There's 2.540 times 10 to the 19th per inch. Okay? There's a bunch of these. Now, to give you a feeling, now you can't actually put electrons side by side, but for our purpose, in our conceptual model, we pretend we can. If you put these 1 inch worth of electrons side by side, and you could count 250 of these per minute, it would take you 19 million years to count them, 1 inch worth. 250 a minute would take you 19 million years to count these things that I've decided to lay side by side in an inch. Is that small? Okay. Can you visualize this imaginary unit I've dealt with in a cube, which would be 1 cubic inch of electrons? If you wanted to count those, it would be 19 million years times 19 million years times 19 million years. A long, long time to count them. Now, so first of all, I've defined a very, very small thing, probably the smallest thing you and I will ever even conceptually encounter, let alone in reality. Now let's take some distances. I can no longer deal with the state of Texas or even in radii of the sun anymore. I want to deal in light years. Okay? How long is a light year? Light travels roughly 186,000 miles per second. Okay? There's about 1.5 million of these to the nearest galaxy. What I want to do is make a ball, not of silver dollars, of these little teeny-weeny electrons. And I don't want to make it as big as the radius to the sun or something. The universe, the entire universe, is estimated to be 6 billion light years in size. Okay? So I'm going to make first of all, I want you to visualize a ball made of the smallest thing possible, these electrons. Okay? To count 1 inch worth would take you 19 million years. I'm going to take a volume of those that's as large as the present conception of our universe. 6 billion light years. Can you visualize a ball like that? Okay? Now, I don't want just one of these balls because that's not big enough. I have to make 500 balls like that every minute for 6 billion years. Now you mark an electron. Now, obviously, the model, you think I'm being facetious. What makes you, those of you that have facility with numbers, go through the arithmetic and try it sometime. When I first heard this example, I thought it was probably, as you often run into, a well-intentioned mistake. And I sat down and spent a Sunday afternoon going through it. And I came away rather overwhelmed because it's substantially understated. It's substantially understated. And I can say it with some knowledge because this happens to be my professional field. And that's how certain we are that Jesus Christ fulfilled those prophecies. I'm more sure that Jesus Christ is the fulfillment of the prophecies of the Mashiach of Israel described in the Old Testament than I am of any other fact available to me in my universe of knowledge, because I've taken the trouble to measure it.